Hello and welcome to NewsClick. We are going to discuss today the Cancun Climate Summit, which is just finished, and what to make of the summit. And to discuss this, we have with us today Mr. Mukul Sanwal, an old hand at the climate game and a former negotiator with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Welcome to NewsClick.
Thank you.
Some people seem to think that the Cancun summit has made a big difference from Copenhagen in mood, if not in content, but that in some ways at least an agreement has been reached and that this bodes well for the Durban summit, and there seems to be some signs that a global agreement may now be in sight. How do you see this?
See, there will be a global agreement because there was an understanding at the Cancun agreements are clear about a new framework. The way I see it is that the Cancun agreements have established a new paradigm. You will recall that in October, before the Cancun agreements, the chief negotiator of the United States, Todd Stern, made a public statement. He said, what we need is a new paradigm. So what is the new paradigm that has emerged from Cancun? This is really a paradigm which establishes the bottom-up approach, and the bottom-up approach is diametrically opposed to the top-down approach of the Kyoto Protocol. So the global community has more or less agreed that there will not be any multilaterally negotiated emission reduction commitments, but that national actions will be recognized and there will be monitoring so that there is transparency and what is usually called a level playing field. But the second big change that has taken place in this is that the two safeguards that the developing countries had in the convention, which really differentiated their commitments with those of the developed countries, were one that their actions will be contingent on the provision of finance and technology. This condition evaporated at Copenhagen when the developing countries agreed to record or inscribe pledges in an agreement, unilateral pledges, which meant they were not contingent on the provision of finance and technology. Now in Cancun, an effort has been made to finish that agenda, the unfinished agenda being that at Copenhagen, the developed countries were not able to get the developing countries to agree to a 2-degree goal, which really meant that the environmental dimension was much more important than sustainable development or eradication of poverty. Irrespective of the level of development, the world will go ahead with keeping emissions below a certain level. Now what happened in Cancun was that they could not get a political agreement on the second aspect of the balance between eradication of poverty and environment, but they have inscribed in the Cancun agreements that they will work towards agreement on a global goal, and there is agreement on keeping the 2-degree limit as an absolute limit for the globe, but the burden sharing formula or how this budget or the burden will be shared has yet to be defined and will be part of the global goal.
In overall architecture of what seems to be emerging for Durban, would I be right in thinking that you seem to see the Cancun as more or less a formalization of the Copenhagen Accords in terms of how the architecture, the new architecture is going to be, which will be, as you said, diametrically opposed to the Kyoto Protocol.
Kyoto Protocol and also to the convention.
That's right.
Because the Cancun agreement, while it provides for the creation of a committee or a mechanism for technology transfer, does not include any discussion of intellectual property rights.
Right.
Now we already had these expert groups. A committee is really an expert group in that sense because it will make recommendations.
Right.
And if it is not going to deal with technology transfer, then it's going to be an advisory role in any case. Similarly with finance, the new green fund is not under the authority of the Conference of the Parties. It's only under the guidance of the Conference of the Parties. And the key issue that developing countries had been fighting for and which was part of the convention, that incremental costs for measures will be met and that these will be provided on a grant or concessional basis.
Right.
Both these elements are absent from the Cancun agreements.
In fact, the Cancun agreement even goes the other way and saying that these funds will be given, doesn't say contingent upon, but it says keeping in mind the obligations and commitments made by the developing countries. In a sense, so if you are good boys, then you will get the money.
And the fact that it is not because of any compensation.
That's right. That's right.
But it is because
It's
because of what you are doing.
Goodwill, or because of what you are doing.
It's not aid, but it's not compensation.
Right.
That point has been made. Right. And in addition, what they are really saying is that this is now going to go more and more to the least developed countries.
Right.
Because since it is contingent on not on the contingent on the provision of finance and technology, but from the actions of the more advanced developing countries.
Right.
So they are not the recipients.
So it is like developmental assistance. It is like aid.
Plus, development assistance plus. And on two grounds. One, it will not go to the major developed countries,
right,
because it is contingent on their actions.
Right.
Their actions are not contingent on this. You see the reversal that has taken place.
Exactly.
And this is going to go to the least developed countries,
right,
whose requirements will be small.
Sure.
So they have also limited the scale of the finances.
Quite right. So coming back to the 2-degree part. Climate campaigners are fairly clear that you need to have a limit on emissions. But the problem has been to have a limit on emissions while the developed countries cutting the most and allowing developing countries the space to increase. The move now seems to be decidedly going, put a ceiling on it, and it's a pledge and review system in any case. So either this 2 degrees limit is not going to mean anything, or development space is going to get constricted.
See, what happened is that this, we go back to Copenhagen, but we should really go back to the Kyoto Protocol.
Yes.
It was in the negotiation of the Kyoto Protocol that the developed countries shifted the focus of the discussion away from stocks to flows of carbon.
Right.
The convention talks about the objective relating to the concentration of GHGs in the atmosphere,
yes,
which is the stock of carbon dioxide,
right,
which is the scientifically correct position.
Correct.
When it came to negotiation of the emission reduction commitments under the Kyoto Protocol, they very intelligently and very strategically shifted that focus to flows of carbon and started recognizing 1990 as some kind of a cutoff,
right,
and emission reductions for emissions that are post 1990,
right,
which means only the flows and not the stocks that have accumulated pre 1990. So once we have got into the flows argument, then they started building scenarios,
right,
showing the trajectory,
right,
of emissions.
right.
And in this calculation, you require a peaking year.
Yep.
If you are looking at stocks, you are looking at a budget.
That's right.
At a volume,
And
at a quantity.
In fact, as you were saying, you're talking about the science guiding this, whereas this has gone more by geopolitical shifts.
And what has happened is that they not only took the discussion to flows, but they started developing scenarios,
yeah,
which they knew, because of the assumptions that have to be made, are not accurate, and they are not useful for taking policy decisions either.
right. The IPCC's report talks about greenhouse gas concentrations, and that is the starting point of the discussions. However, by setting a target in terms of 2 degrees centigrade, which you cannot control, you can't do anything about, what you can do something about is the concentration of greenhouse gases. Why should not that be the main focus of the...
What has happened again is that the IPCC has done a number of things. Some of them we have found out because of the email exchanges.
Sure.
But there is also a footnote in the policy summary of the IPCC, which says that their scenarios, when they are analyzing the reduction potential, have not taken lifestyle issues into account.
Yes.
Now we know that in the developed countries, the key issue of the growth of emissions is because of lifestyle issues,
right,
transportation and buildings. So when the IPCC is calculating the emission reduction potential at a global level, they are acknowledging, but in a footnote, that we have not taken into account lifestyle changes.
Sure.
By not doing that, they have by default, pointed the finger at developing countries. Because if lifestyle changes are taken into account, the cheapest options are lifestyle changes because they don't cost anything.
Sure.
You switch off the light, or you drive a smaller car, or you drive less. So that is one something they did. The other thing that they have done is that while they recognize the science based on concentration, when they started getting into the reduction scenarios,
those are economic rather than scientific.
They are economic rather than scientific.
Sure.
And now the current research also shows that when it comes to the science of it, the atmosphere does not recognize where reductions take place.
Sure.
That is scientifically correct.
Sure.
But what has now been proved to be scientifically correct too is that where reductions take place has different socio-economic impacts on the country concerned.
Of course.
So if you are looking at it only in terms of science, you can argue that it doesn't matter whether the reduction takes place in developed or developing countries, and we should go for the reductions which are the least cost.
Right.
But we also know that where reductions take place has different socio-economic impacts on that society. So you cannot use the least cost argument to drive this.
Sure. Given this dynamic, and we've seen that the Copenhagen structure, the pattern by which the globe is now going to work on this, that agenda has become set. It's starting to get defined in the Cancun agreements, and at least as far as the developed countries are concerned, going forward they would like to seal this as part of the structure of the agreement at Durban. How do you see the next 1 year moving forward, and what do you think India should be doing in this?
I think what I see the next 1 year moving forward will be a two-track approach. And one track, we will be engaged in developing the financial, the green fund and the technology mechanism, where we will be told that this is what we are going to give you as part of our historical commitments, but at the end of the year, we are not going to get anything.
Right.
We will end up with a fund which will disperse loans. Now, if you want loan, you don't go to the green fund, you would go to Wall Street.
Right.
And a technology mechanism which will fund some research, which they will insist developing countries also participate in, but will not deal with the technology, the real technology transfer issues, to make technology easier for access and affordable to developing countries. So in one sense, we will be kept engaged. The real negotiation will take place in some back rooms and will be focused on the global goal. Because you need, once you have agreed to a 2-degree limit, you need to share the burden that is going to impose on countries. Now what is happening is that the United States and the United Kingdom at the national level are moving towards a carbon budget approach. The United Kingdom has legislation on a carbon budget.
Sure.
So that is part of policy. In the United States, the National Academy of Sciences has come out with a report last year, or rather earlier this year, and said that, which says very categorically that to frame a national policy, you must have a national budget as the context for that policy, both to develop it and to assess it.
Sure. So that's a, in order to operationalize it, you do need a top-down structure, but at the global level, they are going
but at
in
the global
opposite
level,
direction.
they are shortcutting this discussion.
That's right.
Taking equity out of the equation and saying that now we have a 2-degree goal, all we need is a global goal.
Yeah.
And in that manner, when they interpret the global goal down the line, that is post-Durban, we will suddenly find ourselves constrained because they would have apportioned or partitioned the atmosphere in a way that would secure for them the kind of carbon space that they need.
So those who are looking to build opinion to influence the outcome at Durban, give me 3 points that you think should be emphasized in the year going forward.
I think the 3 points that need to be emphasized firstly is that there is a phrase in the Cancun agreement which says that the developing countries will have equitable access to sustainable development.
Right.
I believe that has to be redefined or defined very precisely in terms of eradication of poverty, that eradication of poverty remains their overriding priority, as in Article 4.7 of the Convention. That I think is absolutely important. The second issue is that any reductions or any peaking that has to take place before developing countries eradicate poverty has to be contingent on the provision of technology. We may keep finance away. One can say that globalization has taken place or developing countries are getting richer. But without technology, you cannot do it.
Right.
Physically, you cannot do it with the current level of technology. So there has to be some linkage with the availability of the means to achieve a lower peaking level. And the third thing I think is very clearly that when we agree to any monitoring of our emissions or national actions, there again we must emphasize that even at the national level, not only at the global level but at the national level, our priority remains eradication of poverty. Just as the United States said in 1992,
we will not change.
That the American way of life is not up for negotiation. We have to say that eradication of poverty is not subject to negotiation.
Thank you, Mukul.
Thank you. Thank you.